The paralysis started in her fingertips. Elinore tried to lift the teacup, but her hand wouldn't respond. The porcelain sat there on the mahogany armrest, still warm, still full. She had prepared it for Benjamin, measured out the dosage with surgical precision, watched him settle into his chair across from her with that broken, defeated posture he had perfected over the past 6 months. But he hadn't touched it. He had simply looked at her with those hollowed-out eyes and asked if she wanted some instead. She had laughed, dropped the little girl voice entirely, and told him everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every person she had destroyed before him. She wanted him to know exactly who had beaten him before he died choking on his own vomit. That was when he smiled. The numbness crept up her wrists. She looked down at her hands, small and delicate, the hands of a child, and watched her fingers curl inward like dying insects. Benjamin stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, and walked to the library doors. They hissed shut with a sound that didn't belong in an old estate. Steel shutters dropped over the windows with mechanical precision. The room became a vault. Elinore tried to stand, but her legs buckled immediately. She hit the Persian rug hard, her face pressed against wool that smelled like old books and furniture polish. Benjamin crouched down beside her. His voice was different now, measured, clinical, almost curious. He told her he had known everything from the beginning. Some stories don't end the way you think they will. Some revenge isn't hot. It's cold and patient and willing to wait years if necessary. This was one of those. Please prepare yourself emotionally and mentally to hear the rest of this story. The mistake had started 18 months earlier, though Elinore didn't know it yet. She had been hunting for her next mark when Benjamin Wallace appeared in her research like a gift wrapped in black crepe. Billionaire industrialist. Recently widowed. Only child dead under suspicious circumstances that the coroner had ruled natural causes, but the tabloids suggested otherwise. The man was hemorrhaging staph, isolating himself in a coastal estate that looked like something out of a Gothic novel, and drinking himself toward an early grave. The profile was perfect. Vulnerable. Wealthy. Alone. The kind of target that made her work almost too easy. She had spent 3 months building the identity. Elinore Marsh, age 10, orphaned after a house fire in Wales that left no surviving relatives and very few records. The paperwork was immaculate. Birth certificate aged in tea and stored in a safety deposit box that had supposedly sat untouched for years. Medical records showing a growth hormone deficiency that explained her unusually small stature. School transcripts from institutions that had since closed. She had played this role before in different countries under different names, and it had never failed. Men like Benjamin Wallace wanted to fix something. They wanted to save a broken child because they couldn't save their own. It made them easy to control. The approach had been carefully orchestrated. She made sure Benjamin's personal assistant saw her at a charity gala in London, a fragile-looking girl standing alone near the hors d'oeuvres table while her supposed caseworker chatted with donors. She had practiced the expression for weeks. Lost but trying to be brave. Scared but not broken. The kind of face that made adults want to swoop in and rescue. Benjamin had walked past her twice before stopping. He asked if she was all right. She told him she was fine, which was the exact wrong answer, because fine meant she was lying. He donated £500,000 to the organization that night. 2 weeks later, his lawyers contacted the agency about private adoption proceedings. Elinore had smiled when she got the call. The caseworker thought it was happiness. It wasn't. It was the smile of a snake that had just felt the mouse step on its coil. The vetting process should have been exhaustive. Home visits, psychological evaluations, background checks that went back generations. But Benjamin Wallace had the kind of money that made paperwork move faster and questions disappear. The adoption was finalized in 4 months. Elinore flew to the estate on a private jet, her small suitcase full of carefully chosen belongings that suggested a girl who owned very little but treasured what she had. A worn stuffed rabbit, a journal with childish drawings, photographs of people who had never existed. Benjamin met her at the landing strip himself. He looked worse in person than he had in photographs. Thin, graying, the kind of exhaustion that came from months of not sleeping properly. He shook her hand gently, as if she might break, and told her she was safe now. Elinore looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes and thanked him in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. The estate was a fortress disguised as a home. 30 rooms spread across 3 floors, with a staff of 6 that included a housekeeper, a groundskeeper, a cook, 2 maids, and a private nurse who supposedly managed Benjamin's migraines. The building sat on 15 acres of coastal land, accessible only by a single bridge that could be raised during storms. The architecture was all dark wood and stone, with narrow windows and thick walls that made every room feel like a cell. Elinore loved it immediately. Isolated places made her work easier. She spent the first month playing the role perfectly. Quiet at meals, hesitant around strangers, nightmares that brought Benjamin to her door at 2 a.m, where he would sit on the edge of her bed and promise her that nothing bad would happen to her here. She let him see her cry exactly 4 times in those early weeks. Not enough to seem unstable, but enough to make him feel needed. She asked small questions about his daughter, about what she had been like, and watched his face crumble with fresh grief every time. It was almost too easy. The housekeeper was the first obstacle. Mrs. Brennan had worked for the Wallace family for 23 years, and she watched Elinore with the kind of suspicion that came from decades of reading people. She never said anything directly, but Elinore caught the looks. The way Mrs. Brennan's mouth tightened when Elinore called Benjamin father for the first time. The way she positioned herself between them during conversations, as if protecting him from something she couldn't quite name. It was a problem that needed solving. Elinore started small. A missing bracelet that belonged to Benjamin's late wife, discovered weeks later in Mrs. Brennan's quarters during a routine cleaning. Elinore made sure she was the one who found it. Made sure she brought it to Benjamin with tears in her eyes and confusion in her voice, asking why Mrs. Brennan would take something so precious. Benjamin's face had gone white. He called Mrs. Brennan into his office, and the conversation lasted 40 minutes. Elinore listened from the hallway, heard the housekeeper's voice rising in protest, heard Benjamin's tone shift from questioning to cold. Mrs. Brennan was gone by morning. The groundskeeper left 3 weeks later after a series of expensive equipment failures that Elinore had carefully sabotaged. The cook resigned after Benjamin started complaining about the meals, complaints that Elinore had planted during private dinners when she mentioned, very casually, that the food tasted strange. One by one, the staff dissolved. Benjamin blamed himself for not maintaining the household properly. He became more withdrawn, more dependent on the one constant in his life, the little girl who needed him. But something felt wrong even then, though Elinore couldn't identify it. Benjamin was grieving, yes, but there was something underneath it that didn't quite match. He drank, but never enough to lose control. He isolated himself, but his business holdings continued to grow. He seemed broken, but the fractures were too clean, too precise. It bothered her the way a stage set bothers an actor who notices the walls are slightly too thin. She pushed harder. She began mentioning his late wife in passing, innocent questions that slowly became less innocent. Had Mother been happy here? Had she loved the estate as much as he did? Had there been arguments before the accident? Benjamin's responses were always measured, always tinged with sadness, but Elinore thought she detected something else. Relief, maybe. Or vindication. She started leaving small suggestions in his mind, carefully worded doubts about his wife's fidelity, about secret phone calls and unexplained absences. She watched the poison take root. 6 months in, Benjamin stopped visiting her room when she had nightmares. He started spending more time in his study, door locked, working on projects he didn't explain. Elinore told herself it was just depression deepening, the natural progression of a man giving up. She had seen it before. This was the stage where they started signing paperwork, updating wills, making her the primary beneficiary of trusts they thought she was too young to understand. She had already found his personal files, already memorized account numbers and passwords. The endgame was approaching. The medication had been a stroke of luck. Elinore had a genuine medical condition, a hormonal disorder that required careful management to maintain her prepubescent appearance. The black market suppressants were expensive and difficult to obtain, which was why she had been so relieved to find a private stash in Benjamin's medical cabinet during one of her explorations of the estate. The labels were generic, the dosages perfect, and when she ran low on her own supply, she had simply started taking his instead. He never mentioned it, never seemed to notice. It saved her thousands in illegal pharmaceutical costs. She should have wondered why a grieving billionaire kept endocrine suppressants in his bathroom. The winter storm had arrived in early December. 3 days of snow and ice that cut the estate off from the mainland completely. The bridge was impassable. The groundskeeper was long gone, so there was no one to clear the roads. It was just Elinore and Benjamin, alone in 30 rooms that suddenly felt much smaller. She had decided this would be the end. She had prepared the toxin weeks earlier, a slow-acting compound that would mimic a heart attack in a man Benjamin's age, especially one with his fondness for wine and isolation. The coroner would rule it natural causes. The estate would pass to his only living heir. She had made the tea herself that evening, carried it into the library where Benjamin sat reading, and placed it on the small table beside his chair. He thanked her quietly. She sat across from him, her own cup in hand, and waited for him to drink. But he didn't. He just sat there, book open but unread, looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. Calm, almost peaceful, like a man who had just finished a very long project and was admiring the results. That was when Elinore made her final mistake. She dropped the act entirely, let her voice shift into its natural register, 30 years of life bleeding through the 10-year-old face. She told him everything, how she had manipulated him, destroyed his staff, poisoned his memories of his wife, how he was going to die tonight, and she was going to inherit everything he had built. She wanted him to know, wanted him to understand that he had been beaten by someone smarter, colder, more patient than he could ever be. She expected fear, anger, desperate bargaining. Instead, Benjamin smiled, set his book aside, and told her to drink her tea. The escalation happened in layers, each one worse than the last. Elinore refused to drink, obviously. She wasn't stupid, but Benjamin didn't push. He just stood up, walked to the library doors, and locked them with a keypad she had never noticed before. The shutters dropped, the room sealed, and when she tried to stand, tried to run, her body stopped responding. She hit the floor hard. Benjamin crouched beside her, not touching, just observing. He explained that the medication she had been stealing wasn't hers. It had been his daughter's. His real daughter, the one who had died 2 years ago in this very house. The one who had suffered from the same hormonal condition Elinore pretended to have. He had kept the suppressants after her death, partly out of grief, partly because he knew they might be useful someday. He had replaced them 6 weeks ago with something else. A degenerative nerve agent, slow-acting, cumulative, designed to shut down motor function gradually while leaving cognitive ability intact. Elinore would remain conscious, aware, trapped in a body that was already starting to fail. And without the real suppressants, her condition would progress naturally, rapidly, painfully. She would age 30 years and 30 months, and there was nothing that could reverse it now. Elinore tried to scream, but her throat wouldn't cooperate. The sound came out as a wet gasp. Benjamin stood up, brushed off his knees, and walked to a panel in the wall she had always assumed was decorative. It opened to reveal a control system, screens showing surveillance footage from every room in the house. He pressed a button, and the main screen lit up with video from years ago. A nursery, a crib, a small figure standing over it. The figure was Elinore. Different name, different country, different identity. But the same face, the same cold calculation. Benjamin explained that his daughter hadn't died of natural causes. She had been murdered, smothered in her crib by a predator who had infiltrated the household under the guise of a traumatized orphan. The woman had disappeared before the autopsy could prove anything, before the police could build a case. She had vanished into the wind, ready to hunt again. Benjamin had spent 2 years finding her. Millions of dollars tracing identities, bribing officials, tracking medical supply chains. He had found every victim, every false name, every crime scene she had left behind. And when he finally located her, he didn't call the police. He built a trap instead. He made himself the perfect target, fired his staff gradually to seem unstable, drank just enough to seem vulnerable, left financial documents where she could find them, made adoption proceedings move quickly, so she wouldn't have time to look too closely at the paperwork. Every single detail had been designed to make her feel in control. The medication switch had been the final piece. He knew she would find it, knew she would take it, knew that her condition would make her desperate enough to steal from him rather than risk sourcing it herself. He had waited for the levels to build up in her system, waited for the point of no return, and then he had simply let her play out her own endgame. She had poisoned herself. The tea she had prepared for him was sitting untouched on the table. Benjamin picked it up, carried it to the fireplace, and poured it onto the flames. The liquid hissed and spat, filling the room with an acrid smell. Elinore lay on the floor, unable to move, unable to speak, watching him with eyes that still worked perfectly. Benjamin walked back to his chair, sat down, and picked up his book. He read for 20 minutes in complete silence, while Elinore's body continued to shut down. Her fingers were completely numb now. Her legs felt like dead weight. Her breathing was becoming labored. Finally, Benjamin closed the book and looked at her. He told her about the sub-basement, the medical wing that had been built years ago when his daughter's condition had first been diagnosed. State-of-the-art equipment, life support systems, monitoring technology that could keep someone alive indefinitely, even if they couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but exist. He had updated it recently, made sure everything was functional, made sure there was enough stored power to last decades. That was where Elinore would spend the rest of her life. Not as punishment, exactly. Benjamin's voice was eerily calm as he explained this. More as preservation. A living reminder of what his daughter had endured. A monument to the thing that had destroyed his family. The world would believe they had both died in the storm. The estate would be sealed. The records would be scrubbed. And somewhere beneath the stone and steel, Elinore would remain, conscious and aware, aging rapidly in a body that refused to die. No trial, no justice system, no witnesses. Just biology, time, and the quiet hum of machines. The transport happened that night. Benjamin had called someone, though Elinore couldn't tell who. She heard voices, professional and detached, discussing her vitals and prognosis like she was a piece of malfunctioning equipment. Hands lifted her onto a gurney. She couldn't resist. Couldn't even turn her head to see who was touching her. The paralysis had spread to her neck. They wheeled her through corridors she had never seen before, down staircases that descended far below the main house. The air grew colder. The walls changed from wood paneling to concrete to something that looked like reinforced steel. The sub-basement wasn't a basement at all. It was a bunker, a medical facility built to survive catastrophe. The room they placed her in was small, sterile, equipped with monitoring systems that beeped softly in the darkness. They connected her to IVs, to feeding tubes, to waste management systems that would keep her body functional even as it deteriorated. A ventilator stood ready in the corner, waiting for the day her lungs would stop working on their own. Benjamin stood in the doorway, watching the process with an expression that contained no satisfaction, no anger, nothing at all. He told her the staff would check on her periodically, adjust medications, maintain the equipment, ensure she didn't die prematurely. They were well-paid professionals who asked no questions and kept no records. Some of them had worked for him for years. Some were new hires who thought they were caring for a comatose patient from a car accident. None of them would ever know who she really was. The aging would start within weeks. Her body would begin producing the hormones it had been denied for 3 decades. Puberty, menopause, and elderly decline compressed into a span of months. Her face would change. Her bones would ache. Her organs would strain. And through all of it, she would be awake, aware, unable to communicate, unable to end it. Benjamin checked his watch. He had a flight to catch, he said. A private jet scheduled to leave before the roads became completely impassable. By the time the authorities reached the estate to check on them, the house would be empty. The surveillance footage would show 2 people entering the library during the storm and never leaving. The logical conclusion would be that they had both perished somehow, though the bodies would never be found. It wouldn't be the first time a billionaire and his adopted daughter had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The investigation would close within a year. The estate would be sealed as a historical property, too expensive and too remote to be worth maintaining. The bridge would eventually collapse from neglect. The house would slowly crumble into the sea. And in the sub-basement, the machines would continue running. Elinore tried one last time to move, to speak, to do anything that might stop what was happening. Her body remained frozen. Only her eyes still functioned, tracking Benjamin as he turned to leave. He paused at the door. For a moment, she thought he might say something final, some closing statement that would give this meaning. Instead, he simply reached for the light switch and flipped it off. The room plunged into darkness. The door closed with a hydraulic hiss. The lock engaged with a sound like a coffin ceiling. The machines continued their steady rhythm. Beep, hiss, whir, the sounds of a body being kept alive against its will. Elinore lay in the dark and felt the first tremor of accelerated aging begin in her bones. The storm cleared 3 days later. The roads remained impassable for another week. By the time the local authorities made it to the estate, Benjamin was already on a different continent, living under a different name, managing his empire through layers of corporate shells that even the most dedicated forensic accountant would never penetrate. He had built his disappearance as carefully as he had built Elinor's cage. The investigation was perfunctory. 2 officers walked through the empty house, noted the lack of bodies or signs of struggle, and filed a report suggesting the occupants had likely fled during the storm and perished in the wilderness beyond the property line. Search teams combed the woods for a week before giving up. The ocean was suggested as an alternative theory. Perhaps they had tried to leave by boat. Perhaps the weather had been too severe. The estate was officially declared abandoned 6 months later. Benjamin's company, now managed by a board of directors who had never met him in person, donated the property to a historical preservation trust with the stipulation that it remain sealed for 50 years. The bridge was condemned. The gates were chained. A single security company was contracted to perform quarterly checks, though their instructions were specific. Observe the exterior, ensure no vandalism, do not enter the building. No one questioned why a crumbling coastal mansion required such careful monitoring. In the sub-basement, Elinore experienced her first year of compressed aging. Her face, still partially visible in the dim glow of the medical monitors, had begun to change. The delicate features she had maintained through chemistry and discipline were finally betraying her. Lines appeared around her eyes. Her skin lost elasticity. Her hair, once maintained at a child's length, began growing rapidly before graying, before thinning. The hormones flooding her system were trying to make up for 30 years of suppression all at once, and her body was collapsing under the strain. The pain was constant. Her bones ached as if they were trying to grow and shrink simultaneously. Her joints swelled. Her muscles atrophied despite the regular physical therapy the automated systems provided. She developed pressure sores that the medical staff treated with detached efficiency. She suffered hot flashes, mood swings her paralyzed body couldn't express, and a grinding exhaustion that never resulted in sleep because her mind remained cruelly, persistently alert. She couldn't scream, couldn't cry, couldn't even close her eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. The paralysis had settled into a permanent state, though her sensory nerves continued to function perfectly. She felt everything: the feeding tube, the catheter, the electrodes monitoring her failing heart, the mechanical ventilator that had been connected 3 months in when her breathing became too shallow to sustain life. The staff changed every few months. New faces who checked vitals, adjusted medications, and occasionally spoke to each other in low voices about the poor woman who had been in this condition for so long. One nurse, younger than the others, lingered at her bedside one evening. She studied Elinor's face for a long moment, her hand hovering near the call button on the monitor panel. Then she checked the 4-drip, made a notation on her tablet, and left without another glance. Year 2 brought menopause, brutal and swift and unnatural. Her body temperature fluctuated wildly. Her bones became brittle. She developed osteoporosis, so severe that the medical staff had to handle her with extreme caution during routine care. A hairline fracture in her hip appeared one day for no reason at all. It healed poorly. Her skeleton was collapsing from the inside. The monitoring systems recorded everything: heart rate, blood pressure, hormone levels, brain activity. The data was transmitted somewhere, though Elinore would never know where. Benjamin, presumably, though she had no way to confirm. Perhaps he reviewed the reports regularly. Perhaps he had automated the entire operation and never thought about her at all. Year 3. Her face was almost unrecognizable now. The aging had accelerated past what should have been biologically possible. She looked 60, 70. Her skin hung loose, her cheeks hollowed. Her eyes, still sharp and aware, stared out from a face that resembled ancient parchment stretched over bone. The medical scans showed organ deterioration, kidney function declining, liver showing signs of cirrhosis despite never consuming alcohol, heart muscle weakening. During a routine examination, one of the monitoring machines flickered. The room went silent for 3 seconds. Elinore's heart rate spiked, the first genuine physiological response she'd managed in months. The technician frowned at the screen, tapped it twice. The system rebooted, resumed its monotonous rhythm. He made no note of the irregularity. The machines wouldn't allow failure. The staff discussed end-of-life care options one day, standing right next to her bed as if she couldn't hear. How much longer should they maintain aggressive intervention? When should they transition to comfort measures only? They agreed to continue current treatment protocols. Someone was still paying the bills. Someone still wanted her kept alive. She wanted to die, had wanted to die since the first month. But her body, trapped in its medicalized stasis, refused to cooperate. Every system was monitored, regulated, supported. When her kidneys began to fail, dialysis was initiated. When her heart showed arrhythmia, medication was adjusted. When infection threatened, antibiotics were administered. She was kept alive with the same precision she had once used to kill. Year 4 brought symptoms that mimicked dementia, though her consciousness remained intact. Her body was aging without the mental decline that usually accompanied it. She was trapped in a deteriorating prison with perfect awareness of every moment of decay. A new staff member arrived, a medical consultant reviewing long-term patient protocols. He spent 15 minutes in her room with a tablet, reviewing her charts. He looked directly at her eyes, held her gaze. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something like recognition flickering across his features. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then glanced at the camera mounted in the corner. He closed his mouth, updated her file, left the room, never returned. 5 years. 6. 7. The faces changed. She lost count, lost track of time entirely. The medical monitors provided no calendar, no clock, no indication of anything beyond her failing vital signs. She existed in an eternal present tense, each moment identical to the last, each breath a mechanical wheeze from the ventilator that had become as much a part of her as her own lungs. Her mind remained sharp, which was its own unique torture. She remembered everything, every victim, every manipulation, every life she had ended or ruined in pursuit of wealth she would never spend. She had no capacity for regret, exactly, but she had infinite capacity for awareness. She understood what had been done to her, understood that it was proportional, understood that Benjamin Wallace had built a punishment that would last exactly as long as she did, which, thanks to the medical technology surrounding her, might be decades still. No redemption arc occurred, no moral awakening. She didn't soften or find peace or discover humanity in her final years. She remained exactly who she had always been, just trapped and deteriorating. The only difference was that now she had nothing but time to experience the consequences. The estate was finally demolished in year 12. The Preservation Trust had dissolved due to financial irregularities. The property was sold to a development company that planned to build luxury condos on the coastal land. Surveyors walked the grounds, took measurements, filed permits. The demolition crew arrived on a Tuesday morning with heavy equipment and a 3-week timeline. They started with the outer buildings, the old stable, the groundskeeper's cottage. They worked their way toward the main house, unaware of what lay beneath. The basement levels weren't on any of the official blueprints. The sub-basement didn't exist in any county records. When they finally broke through the foundation, they discovered corridors that shouldn't have been there. The foreman called the police. The officers who descended into the medical wing found a facility that looked like something from a science fiction film. Sterile, maintained, fully powered despite the house above being abandoned for over a decade. And in the smallest room, connected to enough medical equipment to run a small hospital, they found a body. Or what had been a body. The medical examiner estimated the deceased had been in her 80s at time of death, though the condition of the remains made precise determination difficult. Cause of death appeared to be multiple organ failure. Time of death was harder to establish. The ventilator had continued running long after her heart had stopped, circulating air through dead lungs. The other systems had followed their programming, administering medications, maintaining temperature, recording data that no one would ever review. She had died alone, possibly weeks earlier, possibly months. The machines had faithfully preserved what they could and documented what they couldn't. The investigation that followed was brief and inconclusive. No identification could be made. Dental records matched no one. DNA yielded nothing. The medical equipment bore no serial numbers. The facility had been scrubbed of anything that might indicate ownership or purpose. The best theory was some kind of illegal medical experiment, though there was no evidence to support even that. The body was eventually cremated as a Jane Doe. The ashes were interred in a county cemetery plot. No headstone, no service, No one to mourn. The development project continued. The house was demolished. The foundation was filled. Luxury condos were built on the bones of the Wallace estate, their residents completely unaware of what had existed beneath their granite countertops and ocean view balconies. Benjamin Wallace, if he was still alive, never came forward, never claimed the body, never acknowledged what he had done. He had promised Elinore that her imprisonment would last the remainder of her shortened life, and he had delivered exactly that. Nothing more, nothing less. The trap had closed perfectly. Predator had become prey. The woman who had spent 30 years hunting the vulnerable had died in a cage built specifically for her measurements, maintained by systems that cared nothing for her suffering, in darkness that never lifted. No justice was served in any traditional sense. No trial, no sentencing, no legal framework that could have accounted for what had transpired. Just one monster destroying another monster with the same cold calculation that both had perfected over their respective careers. The world moved on without ever knowing the story. This was Revenge Chronicles. Some endings don't close clean. Some stories leave stains that never wash out, archived in places most people will never look. This was one of them. The Wallace case exists now in a handful of police reports filed under unknown subject, in medical examiner notes marked inconclusive, in demolition records that mention a subterranean structure with no clear purpose. Benjamin Wallace disappeared from all official records in 2024. Elinore Marsh, and the dozen other names she had used, were never connected to the body in the sub-basement. The truth died in that room, preserved only in surveillance footage stored on encrypted servers that will eventually decay into unrecoverable noise. What remains is this: a man who lost everything built a perfect trap. A woman who stole everything walked into it willingly. And when the door closed, it stayed closed.